Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of A Small History Podcast. I apologize for the lengthy delay between episodes. I hope everybody had a fantastic holiday season and New Year, and everything is getting off to a good start in 2026. Today, I will be discussing my recent trip to Japan, picking up from where I left off in episode 1. It was a fantastic trip. I spent 3 weeks taking the Golden Route from Tokyo to Kyoto, Osaka, and then back to Tokyo. I also spent some time on day trips in Nara and Himeji near Kyoto, and I wanted to talk a little bit about my trip. That's what's going to be a bit more of the focus in this episode, but I also want to dedicate some time to talking about the shrines, the museums, and a little bit about religion and history within Japan more broadly. I could talk about everything I spent over the 3 weeks for hours, maybe days, so I decided I would break it up into segments. In this first segment, as I said, I wanted to talk specifically about the shrines to start, and just a little bit about the early history of Japan, and frankly why there are so many shrines across the country and what they represent. This is also a way where I can talk a little bit about it from my perspective as a Canadian. Through the time I've been discussing it with other people, I tend to get the discussion, the point where, compared to Canada, let's say, Japan has a much longer history. Now, I do disagree to some aspects with that opinion. Yes, Canada doesn't have the same amount of shrines or old buildings beyond Confederation or 1700, often at the earliest, but to say that Canada has no history is a bit misleading, and it also downplays the effects of the colonialist period, residential school systems, the subjugation of indigenous peoples, and frankly, working counter to our own history. We have maybe not necessarily intentionally, but we have destroyed our own history of our country. And to also layer on the fact that there were multiple indigenous nations, tribes, groups, depending on how you want to word it, there are a lot of people whose stories will now no longer be told because of the residential school policies and the eradication of indigenous groups. Whereas compared to Japan, they have done a much better job in formulating this narrative of a unified national identity in which a lot of their culture, practices, traditions, and shrines have been preserved. That being said, I'm going to jump right in and talk first and foremost about some of the shrines I visited and what they represent, and to start, the two main religions of Japan, Shinto and Buddhism. One of the first shrines I went to on my trip was Sensoji Temple, which is pictured here. Sensoji is one of the major Buddhist shrines in central Tokyo. It's a little bit to the east of the Imperial Palace in Ueno, which is a little bit north of Akihabara and the Imperial Palace. And to begin, just to talk broadly about the two religions. So in Japan, you have Shinto and you have Buddhism. I'll begin with Shinto. Shinto is the predominant domestic religion from Japan, meaning that it was founded within Japan, it's native to Japan, and you don't really see it exported to other areas. You don't see a ton of it in Korea or China, for instance, but there are a lot of elements that have now been sort of blended in with Buddhism where there's a lot of similarities. Shintoism dates back to at least 200 BC, and there's kind of two parts to it. The one part of Shintoism has to do with the polytheism of it. So it is a multi-god believing religion. It's not like Christianity where there's only one God. It's the belief that there's multiple gods. And while you have some that are higher on the pecking order of others, the most notable and most important of which being Amaterasu, the god, the sun god, the god of heaven. There are It's the belief that there are spirits and living within all the elements of nature and everything around you. So there's spirits of nature, there's spirits of light and dark, there's spirits of the elements of wind, fire, water, earth, and spirits of light and dark. So all of these elements being together, all of these shrines that are all very narrowly focused on one aspect that deviate from that. So you have shrines that are dedicated to a lot of the Chinese zodiacs. There's temples committed to the ox or the rabbit or the snake. And then there are other shrines which deal with the more contemporary state Shintoism, which tend to focus more on the sun goddess Amaterasu and the descendancy of the imperial family the from the goddess Amaterasu. The emperor and the imperial family. The emperor is often known as the son of heaven, and that directly relates to this connection to the god Amaterasu. Most notably, there is the Ise Shrine in Mie Prefecture. It's not one place I visited on my trip, and it's a place you actually can't visit if you're just a tourist. It is so sacred that it is protected, to which you can only see the rooftops of the buildings if you were to go and visit. It is located kind of right in the center of the country, but to the south of Nagoya and to the east of Nara. And that, along with shrines that were built in the Meiji period, like the Yasukuni Shrine and the Meiji Jingu Shrine, have a lot more priority placed on the imperial family and worshiping its role within Japan as a national unifier. The example here in Sensoji Temple is actually an example of the other type of shrine, the Buddhist shrines. Buddhism, unlike Shintoism, is not native to Japan. It is an imported religion. So it originally comes from India with the Buddha, and it was then imported eastward to China, and then was further imported eastward through Korea into Japan roughly around 600 AD. So there's about an 800-year gap between Shintoism and Buddhism being introduced into Japan. Shintoism is also a religion that's very much focused on the present. It's about worshiping, being thankful for the spirits that are around you right at this moment. Buddhism is a lot more focused on the concept of inner peace, that concept of reaching nirvana or that Zen mode. There's two main types of Buddhism as well as some other ones, but the two main ones in Japan are Pure Land Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, but they very much focus on a lot of the same morals on being a good person and praying to the Buddha and their bodhisattvas and the guardians that all descend, and achieving that elevated level to reach ascendancy. And in doing so, it will give you a better afterlife. So this is just the Reader's Digest abbreviated version. There's a lot more complicated elements to it. But as you can see, for example, in this image of Sensoji Temple, you can see two guardian statues kind of off to the side beside the two lanterns that are there as protectors of the shrine. And as you go and you wander in, there's a lot of cultural practices that are consistent to both types of shrines. For instance, you never want to walk down the very center of the walkways. You always leave that pathway clear for the spirits, so you always walk to one side or the other. You will bow as you enter in through the gates as a sign of respect to the spirits, and again as you go into the temple itself. Oftentimes you're not allowed to take photos of the shrines themselves. Usually it will have a Buddha or a Bodhisattva in the center. There might be some other elements there. Often there's scriptures in Buddhism that are enshrined, whereas in Shinto there isn't a formal written scripture of code that you have to follow. You bow to them, you deposit your money, you will clap your hands twice, you'll bow again and say your prayers whether or not you're reading or reciting scripture out loud, which some individuals do, or you just make a quiet prayer within your own head, and then you depart and be on your way. I probably visited around 20 throughout Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka on my trip. I don't have photos of all of them included here, but there are a number of the major ones that I have shown. Sensoji Temple, as I said, was one of the largest in Tokyo. Another example here in Tokyo, a bit south of there, is Canada Myojin. One thing that you'll see in a lot of shrines, whether it's Buddhist or Shinto, a lot of elements are taken from the Tang Dynasty in China, which ruled from around 600 to around 800 AD. Some things you'll see a lot of imported elements, such as the vermilion red on a lot of these structures, which is a good luck color. It's meant to be very warm and used to phase off evil spirits, to keep them away from the shrines, and as protection. There's a lot of gold accents on a lot of the structure. There's a lot of jade, and all of that is imported from China, as well as there are also some other cultural elements. So while Confucianism isn't as openly practiced as Buddhism or Shinto, you do have elements from Confucianism, such as filial piety. Filial piety is the belief of a sort of hierarchy within society and the virtues associated with it. So the idea that you need to be you have to have good master-servant relations. You have to have good paternal relationships, so the head of the household usually being male, and then the fathers or the sons that descend are respectful and obeying the wishes of their grandfathers, as well as the relationships between friends and sensei and master-student relationships. So all of that is also kind of intertwined on a cultural level, even if it's sometimes not explicitly shown or demonstrated through open scripture. And you see that as you go through Japan's history, the way that the imperial system and the shogunate system have kind of evolved. They've evolved differently than it is in China, where rather than having formal bureaucrats out across the prefectures of Japan collecting taxes like you do in China, you do have the shogunates and the daimyo acting in that role, but also in a more military capacity. So some other elements, some other shrines that I walked around that I seen through my trip. These are three of the major ones within Kyoto, to the west of Tokyo. You have Fushimi Inari Taisha in the middle, which is one of my favorites that I visited. It's certainly one of the most physical demanding. That is the one most known for its 1,000 torii gates. You go up almost 1,000 steps to reach the summit, and you pass through hundreds of these gates painted that same vermilion, orange, red color, all of them having scriptures on them. It seems like, if you don't know Japanese, that they are worshiping or making some sort of prayer, but really it's often just companies that have paid to sponsor one or more of the Shinto gates as good luck. Often tour groups will only go about halfway up, where there's a three-way fork in the road. There is a really good view out to the greater metropolitan Kyoto area, and that's usually where they turn around and head back. But if you keep going like I did, you get to this relatively small summit that has a beautiful little quaint shrine there. And one thing I will say, just as an explorer and a traveler, it was really cool to accomplish something like that, to make it all the way to the summit, and say you're one of maybe 1 in 10 people who actually go all the way up to the top. It's a really rewarding feeling to say I was able to accomplish all of these feats in just 3 weeks. In Kyoto alone, I was only there for a week, and I managed to go to some 20 different shrines and castles and historical sites, which was amazing. Toji Temple is the pagoda, the 5-story pagoda is pictured on the right. It's one of the easiest to get to, as it is almost immediately west of the Kyoto station. There are two major temples there. There is the lecture hall and the main hall. The lecture hall actually has more of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas that you'll see inside, and then Toji Temple just has the main Buddha and two Bodhisattvas representing night and day, or the sun and the moon. And then the 5-story pagoda is just a little bit to the southeast of there. I got really lucky because it had rained as I got to Kyoto, but because of which the grounds were almost empty, and I was able to explore with very few people around. And that, as part of my travel advice, is one of the things I can say is very beneficial to the time difference and coming here as a traveler. If you can adjust your body to get up at 5, 6 in the morning and get to these temples right as soon as they open, you can see in the photos that there really aren't that many people around, and it is really handy at getting some really nice intimate photos without a bunch of other tourists around. The other thing that was really nice going to Toji Temple at the time that I did, at November, December, they actually open the ground level to the pagoda, so you're able to go in, walk around the base, not up the tower, but just around the bottom of it. And they have a little shrine to each direction, sort of that feng shui element of good luck. So you can go to each of those and bow at each direction as a sign of respect there. And then the other pagoda on the left, the small 3-story one, is not Kiyomizu-dera itself, but the Kiyasu Noto pagoda, which you see a lot of them if you know where to look around Japan. There are a lot of shrines that are dedicated to fertility, and often couples that are either trying to conceive or couples that have just recently conceived a child will often pray at temples like these. As such, there are also a lot of shrines dedicated to rabbits, as you can imagine, also dealing with fertility. Here's Kiyomizu-dera more up close. Kiyomizu-dera was the one shrine I went to that was absolutely packed with tourists, the other being the Arashiyama bamboo forest. I would have to say those are probably the two most popular shrines I went to, and then probably the aforementioned Fushimi Inari Taisha being the other one. Kiyomizu-dera is one of the main temples of Buddhism, and most recently, when they're doing the end of the year ceremonies and festivities, there was a monk that painted the word of the year in a big dramatic art display, where the word of the year was displayed to be Kuma, the bear, because of all the bear attacks that had happened this past year in Japan. And Kiyomizu-dera was the backdrop if you watch the footage of it. Kiyomizu-dera is really important for Buddhism, and it is one of the oldest and most unique shrines in that the base that it is built upon, as you can see in this photo, is actually built without any nails constructed. That being said, I found it was maybe one of the most underwhelming, because despite how big it looks here from this angle on the outside, there wasn't really a lot of area that you could actually go in and see. There was only a small part in the one temple that you could go and bow and pray in, and the rest of it was really closed off and left just for the monks and the disciples of the shrine. Some other shrines I went to as well that are in the area also include Nasenji, and which is another similar structured shrine. There's a couple other temples as you get to Kinkakuji, that also have large gateways that you can go out to and see. A lot of the architecture, if it's not painted in this vermilion red, you get a lot of this sort of wooden aesthetic with some gold accents. Kodaiji Temple's another one that I went and saw. All of these are along the eastern portion of Kyoto too, which made walking from place to place fairly easy. So I went to Fushimi Inari Taisha, and then I went first in the morning, and then I wandered to Tofukuji, and then I walked up to Kiyomizu-dera, and then I was able to do all of that, continue north to Yasaka Shrine, and then venture west back to my hotel, which was close to Nijo Castle. So you can do all that in a day if you're ambitious enough, but keep in mind it's a lot of walking if you do that. It's about I walked probably around 15 to 20 kilometers each day through all of it. Another major shrine that is there right as soon as you get off at Kyoto is Higashi Honganji. It was probably the largest of all the shrines that I was able to go and see the inside of. It had one of the largest expanses of walking room. One thing that you'll see is typical with a lot of them is they expect you to take your shoes off and carry them around. Sometimes, as you can see, kind of beside the rope that hangs down, if you look to the right of the prayer box, donation box, there is a place where you can take a bag and put your shoes in and carry them around with you. Otherwise, you can often just leave them at the base to the right of the shrine and go in just in your socks or in slippers if you have them. And then when you go inside, there's tatami mats, there's lots of incense and Buddhist statues around. At the time I happened to be in there, there was a monk giving a sermon, and there were people actively praying and conducting their ritual service when I went in the morning there. So it's always a good note to be as polite as possible, to not talk, to bow as you go in, to just be respectful, be quiet, try not to make a scene. And if you follow those steps, you just say a brief arigato gozaimasu to the security guards as you walk in. A lot of that simple element of showing respect goes a long way, and I've never had any issues in any of the shrines. One question you might ask too is about security. So often as you go in, there'll be a toll gate where you'll have to buy your ticket. There was never any huge rush to get in when I went in November and December. If you're going more during the peak seasons, like during the cherry blossom season in the spring, I imagine it will be a bit longer. Some places you can buy your tickets in advance online, other places you can't. There's usually security guards as you go into the shrines, and usually there's either security or volunteers as you go into the direct shrine itself, not the gate area. And often they're not, they're more just to enforce the fact that at a lot of these shrines you simply cannot take photos. So they're enforcing that, and just as long as you're quiet and you show respect, you'll usually have no issues. Continuing with the Kyoto aspect, I went to visit Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, but before it was open, Ryoanji was open before that, so I went there first. Ryoanji is built in the 15th century and is famous for its Zen garden, which is pictured here. Interesting about the Zen garden is that the walls that are outside are constructed with oil within the clay that they made around it. So all the discoloring, the sort of change from the black to the light brown and back to the black, all comes from the oil that's seeping out. So over the 600 years that it has been around, all of that color has changed and transformed over time. But the Zen garden has remained pretty much untouched since its inception. And then there's it from another angle there. What was really nice on this trip too was there were often moments when you go to these Zen gardens, you've taken your shoes off. The nice thing you can do is just have the freedom to sit cross-legged and just sort of meditate or just relax and be at peace. Ryoanji also has a really nice small koi pond outside. There were a lot of ducks swimming around, so you're able to go and observe those, observe the fish. There is often a heron or a crane hanging around as well. Daikakuji, which I will show later, is another example of that, which had a nice pond around it. But one of the two kind of showcase buildings within Kyoto was Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion. There's a ton of history just in Kinkakuji and Ginkakuji. A lot of it has to do centered around one of the final Ashikaga shoguns, Ashikaga Yoshimasa. Yoshimasa was a guy who very much focused more on the cultural and spiritual elements of Japan, of Buddhism, of Shintoism, and his rule, much so than the militaristic aspects of it. He was very much the idea of spending all the collected taxation money on these extravagant shrines like Kinkakuji. He put gold leaf around it, and he was planning to do the same for Ginkakuji, but with silver leaf. So Kinkakuji, the kin is gold, the gin in Ginkakuji, very similar names, is silver. Ginkakuji did not get the gold leaf around it, however, as you can see pictured here. But these two shrines are sort of the epitome of his extravagance of putting money into things like this, whereas the country around him was starting to grow with political dissent and amnesty frustrations from other daimyo around. And it reached a tipping point when he originally did not plan to have an heir, and he promised his brother that he would be next in line to be the shogun. Instead, his wife unknowingly or unexpectedly gave birth to a son, and then, as you can imagine, there was a political fallout over, okay, who is the true heir? Is it the son or is it the brother? It leads to a period known as the Onin War and descends into the Warring States period, where each daimyo is fighting with each other over their domains, what are now the prefectures of Japan, and it leads to the unification, first by military conquest by Oda Nobunaga, and then later through Toyotomi Hideyoshi's policies, and then through the Tokugawa shogunate, which then rules Japan from around the year 600, a little after, until the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s. So you have Kinkakuji, which is kind of on the northwest side of the country, and then you have Ginkakuji, which is on kind of the northeast side, as pictured there. And then you also have Daikakuji, which is even more west of Kinkakuji and Ryoanji. Daikakuji, I would argue, is the most underrated of all the shrines, and one of the ones I would say to go see if you want a more intimate experience. Daikakuji was an imperial villa for one of the emperors dating back to around 814, 815, and it has a number of smaller pagodas and shrines within it. There's the main one as kind of you first walk in there, but there is a large pond around it to the east. That was the one I mentioned is similar to Ryoanji, and there are a number of little shrines. There's the Tenjin shrine, which has the sacred tree, and right beside it there's also a shrine specifically dedicated to good luck in your academics. So if you are here to learn or to study, it is certainly one of the best shrines to go to make a prayer for good luck there. And the fact that it was a former imperial villa is really fascinating. There's the elements of the older sort of Tang Dynasty inspired sort of uh, empire system that very much resembles China, where you have the large imperial gates that lead into the assembly hall and then the palace, but then you have these kind of villa style vacation areas almost like you have with the imperial palace in Kyoto, in the Kyoto National Garden. So it's really interesting to see how that element of the administrative and bureaucratic side of Japan is different from the villas or sort of the vacation homes in a way. And then how that also contrasts with castles such as Nijo Castle in Kyoto or Osaka and Himeji Castle. One of the other things I would say too with Daikakuji, it's way better to go see that than the Arashiyama bamboo forest. And one reason being that Daikakuji has its own bamboo forest, so you do not have to go to the crowded areas. You can instead go to this bamboo forest here and look at bamboo without being surrounded by thousands of other people. In Uji, it has another major Buddhist shrine, Byodo-in. Byodo-in was extremely cool to see because it's built on its own little island. It has a separate tour to go to the actual structure on the island, in addition to the base fare to get into the temple grounds. However, the museum is one of the nicest, I think, of all the ones I went to. On a lot of the Buddhas, you will see a cloud in scripture towards the backing, and there are the in Byodo-in there are sculptures of all the cloud spirits, the bodhisattvas, that are on the backs of the Buddha, and you can see each one of them. And there's a little guide as you go in that tells you which each one of them represents. So it was one of the neatest to see from that element, and to understand that these were almost 1,000 years old and are still so remarkably preserved even to today. It says a lot about how much people, even as I said 1,000 years ago, care about how well they were protecting them. There's also across the river, there's a beautiful Uji River and a mixture of different bridges you can take to go across, and a lot of it is tied to the tale of Genji. If there's anything that sort of is used as a tome for Shintoism, the tale of Genji is often recited as one. It is one of the most significant novels of Japanese classics, and there is a museum near the Ujikami Shrine on the north side of the river there that you can visit. And if you walk a little more further to the next station north in Obaku, you can go to Manpukuji, which is another one of these Buddhist shrines that's really closely tied into Chinese Buddhism and elements of that. And then on my trip, the next place I went to after Kyoto was in Nara. In Nara, there is the Nara Park, which kind of goes up a big hill. When you get off Nara Station and you venture east, you'll see the hilly landscape. And as you venture there, you will go to Kofukuji, which has its own 5-story pagoda, which is unfortunately under long-term renovations. So it was covered in a big tarp. But among Kofukuji, there is the Buddhist temple there. And there's another museum that you can go see. The National Treasure Museum was really cool to go see because there are a couple of bodhisattvas that were almost destroyed due to fires in the National Temple, and then they got moved into the museum in order to keep it preserved. Kofukuji also has a special one of the structures. It kind of looks like where you keep the bread in Christianity when it's not being used. You have that urn structure, when you go in there, there's a Buddha that's only shown there during certain times of the year, right around the New Year. So there's some cultural elements like that that are great to appreciate and to learn about when you go and travel. There's also one of the scriptures is held in its own sort of mini pagoda structure as well. So it's really cool to see all of that. I apologize, I'm not elaborating as well as I can, but there's so much to talk about. And when I break down it more specifically, I'll have more detailed explanations to all of it. So Kofukuji is kind of the first thing you see as you go up the hill, and you recognize as being a shrine temple area. But if you venture a little bit more northeast, you will then get to the south gate of Todaiji. This was built around the year 1300, and the gate is very much from the period. And then you get to Todaiji, which is probably one of the most famous buildings in all of Japan because it hosts the Grand Buddha, the Daibutsuen, which, as you go inside, you have this massive, I believe it's 70 or 80 feet tall Buddha. The temple originates in the 700s, but has been rebuilt multiple times. I believe the most recent being in the late 1700s or the early 1800s. As you can see here, as I mentioned before, Todaiji, you have the cloud inscriptions on the back of the Buddha. And if you go back to Byodo-in, that's, to my understanding, what each of those clouds represents. And they have statues of each individual one there at Byodo-in. But just to get a size of perspective, they have a model of just the hands out in an open area on display, and to roughly guesstimate, it's around 15 feet tall, probably about 3 people if they were standing shoulder to shoulder. That's about how tall they are. So it gives you a perspective and an appreciation for just how impressive it was to be able to cast such a structure 1300 years ago. Then on the second half day on my trip to Nara, you can venture west and you can go to the Heijo Palace. Heijo Palace it's a really interesting site right now because it is a good case lesson on how archaeology is practiced and how they work on taking what was discovered through archaeology. You can go to the museum that they have there where they show the excavated site of part of the palace grounds, but then they're also using it as a way, as a reconstruction, where they have the Suzuka Gate in the very south entrance, and then they have the Imperial Audience Chamber in sort of the middle portion, halfway between there and the Emperor's chambers in the north with the throne on it. And this, more than any, really kind of represents the Tang Dynasty and how they tried to really replicate that in Japan before the shogunate started to take hold. And the structures, like I mentioned, are very similar. The layout of the grounds is similar. And to the east, you would have all of the housing for the ministers and the guards. And then further east into the west, you have the housing for the common folk. Around 200,000 people living in this area, around 1 by 1.7 kilometers. As to get an example from the scale, so on the left is the area leading up to the gate, and that's only about halfway to it. You could go twice as far south and still have all that empty space leading towards the gate. The middle is about midway between the gate and the audience chambers that they're reconstructing at this time. So you're looking from the middle to the gate to the south. Now they've built a railway track through it, but you can see that the Suzuka Gate looking south there, and then on the right, that's turning 180 degrees and looking north towards the audience chamber. And then from there, you have the same distance roughly from the audience chamber to the the emperor's throne room, the Dai-Chiji Daigokuden, which has the throne, and a lot of it is reconstructed based on what they've been able to find and what they know, but there's still some uncertainty. So the throne is only a artist's rendition based on historical evidence on what they think the throne room looks like. There isn't any certainties as to that actually being 100% how the throne looked. Now, all this also connects me to the next place on my trip out west in Osaka. But before that, going to Osaka, I also want to mention the castles that are there. Japan is famous for its castle architecture, the most famous and most well preserved of which is Himeji Castle. Himeji is known as the White Heron Castle, and it is very much resembling what the majority of castles looked like from the 1600s. So as kind of the Warring States period is going on and you're starting to deal with the unification of Japan, a lot of castles are modeled after this structure. So you have a very large moat outside, you have a very large keep, and a very windy path up. And going inside, it is a true castle and preserved in as accurate as you can get to the period. They recently spent some time in the 2010s restoring it and making it, repainting it, redoing the tiling, but for the most part, you go inside, there's no elevators, there's no ramps. It is a challenge to visit if you have difficulties with stairs, and very steep stairs, might I add, trying to climb up to the top of the castle and looking out, but you get these really fantastic vantage points. You can get up to the battlements and you can take a tour through where they would have warehouses with storage houses within the castle grounds, and where people would be living, whether it's soldiers or even members of the daimyo's family living within relatively small quarters. Imagine living out of a bedroom, doing all your regular duties, eating, sleeping, meditating, all in one room, and sleeping in a tatami on the floor. Here's another up close view of Himeji. Another thing I will appreciate on my trip going in November is that it only really rained on one day of the trip when I got in Kyoto. Very much the majority of the trip was these clear or slightly overcast skies, especially in the mornings. And then you go to Osaka, where rather than being like Himeji as a proper, true, authentic castle, Osaka is more of a museum with a castle facade around it. The original Osaka castle was built by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and it was a little bit south of where the current Osaka castle is. It's right about where I was standing where I took this photo of the existing Osaka castle. When the Tokugawa Ieyasu took over as the new ruler, the new shogun of Japan, he destroyed the original Osaka castle and buried it under several feet of rubble in order to delegitimize his Toyotomi Hideyoshi's reign and to establish his own. He then built the new Osaka castle just north, and over time they have renovated it. They've installed an elevator inside, so it's really a lot more like an actual museum in the sense that it's way more accessible to be able to go inside and visit. However, they do have an element of the Toyotomi stone wall. There's a separate museum that was built recently just to the east that you can go in with your admission to the castle and see part of the old Toyotomi Hideyoshi castle. And then there's also a former barracks a little south of there on the grounds that is now converted into sort of a restaurant, shopping mall. But that, leading up to the Second World War, this castle was used as a staging ground and a training site for members of the Japanese military. If you're done seeing that, Then you can do what I did and go across the street to the NHK building of Osaka, where they have the Museum of History. The Osaka Museum of History is fascinating because you actually go up to the top floor of the NHK building, and the top 3 floors is all a museum that focuses on the history of Osaka, dating back to the period kind of coinciding with the Han Castle in Nara just after they moved north. Well, they built almost an identical type of castle grounds in Osaka, and it is immediately south of the castle. They have built a highway across since, but you can see the remnants of where on the left side of the picture, what would be north of the highway, you have the emperor's main palace, and then directly south where the middle of the photo is, you have the imperial audience chamber. And this was almost immediately following the Nara period. They briefly moved to several other cities in Japan before returning back to Nara and then permanently moving north to Kyoto. But you can see almost identical structure of the design, but rather than Nara, where they're trying to rebuild a lot of it, Osaka has taken the approach of using it as sort of a multi-purpose park facility where people could go out and walk their dogs or play catch or soccer or what have you, but have the historical elements of the old palace existing here. So there's different ways you can look at it. The Osaka Museum also has elements that deal with the evolution from the warring period where Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu established their reign, but then also dealing with the modern industrial evolution and the complex challenges Japan faced, shifting from a feudal state in the 1860s still, and rapidly industrializing through technology, most notably being their railway network, and rapidly industrializing. Osaka was most famously known as the Manchester, the Liverpool of Japan, in that it became that same kind of British Industrial Revolution city with lots of factories, with lots of pollution, but also the rapid transition of imperial and kind of old style living, people with kimonos shifting into a modern dress, suit and tie, and top hat style way of living as it modernized. Another temple shown here too is Zojoji Temple. This was one of the last ones I visited, and you can see it is very close to the Tokyo Tower with it in the background. This was one of the major shrines vital to the Tokugawa shogunate, and there actually just to the east there are a number of the graves of members of the Tokugawa family. The Tokugawa relocated the capital from Kyoto to Tokyo, Edo, because that was the main region where the Tokugawa was from. So there are a lot of buildings there and elements that are dedicated to his role in that shrine as well. But it very much follows similar structure. You go in, there's incense burning, there's the Buddha statues to make your prayers at. And it would be wrong to not also bring in the Meiji Restoration. Through the Meiji Restoration, this is where you get a lot more of the focus on the imperial family, and one of the ways the Meiji Emperor was able to do so was erecting shrines like the Meiji Jingu Shrine, which was sited on part of his estate, the summer home. There's a tea house there, which his wife and him spent a lot of time left on the grounds. But then also near the end of his reign, they built this shrine, and they had members of the community planting all the trees that now make up the grounds of the shrine. And while you have on the aforementioned shrines in the east that I mentioned, the Sensoji Temple, you have on this one here is on the west side, closer to Shibuya and Shinjuku. And then you have the Tokyo Tower as well, pictured there. And then the other major shrine too is the Yasukuni Shrine. The Yasukuni Shrine was built in the 1860s, I believe, as well, to honor the country's war dead, specifically after the Meiji Restoration period. And this is probably one of the more controversial shrines because you have a lot of challenges dealing with the entombment of Japan's war dead, which includes people who were convicted of war crimes during the Tokyo War Crimes Trial after the Second World War. And you have a museum that tries to explain the elements of the Great Pacific War, the 15-year war. You have elements talking about the Russo-Japanese War and the earlier Sino-Japanese War, the first one. And it tries to contextualize it by talking about Japan's contributions to these events, but also dealing with the controversies, or in a way not dealing with the controversies of war crimes that you hear from China, from America, from Britain. And it too is really hard to contextualize it because whereas the European war is very much more black and white, like it's clear that the Nazis were an evil regime with their concentration camps to get rid of Jews, gypsies, gays, intellectuals, other types of objectors, direct or conscientious. The war in the Pacific is so much different because, yes, you can point to the atrocities that Japan committed in Asia, but then you also have to then look at Britain and its empire in India. You have to look at France and its empire in Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, that region. You have to look at America in the Philippines. You have to look at Spain to a lesser extent in that. So there's all of these other elements that you're dealing with that make it a much more complicated war to talk about. And it was also interesting too, you get to see you see a lot of the elements of war, the technology. When you go into the conclusion of the war, there's an exhibit with just thousands of photos of Japan's war dead, the soldiers that fought. You have letters and dolls that children gave to their fathers or their grandparents or their sons, their brothers fighting. And it really tries to portray the human element and the human sacrifice of war, and moving towards this notion of just peace. To move on from that, though, you also have museums that are dedicated to modern technology. As I mentioned before, you have the Osaka Museum, but you also have the Kyoto Railway Museum, which is really fascinating. You have a former rail yard, which is now converted. The main rail yard has some 15 or 20 steam charcoal powered trains, but then you also have exhibits dedicated to electric powered trains like this one here. You have an example of one of the steam powered trains here with a Formula One car beside. There's also the MP4 McLaren F1 car that Aaron Senna and Aaron Prost drove in the Railway Museum as well. And you also have some of the more high-tech Shinkansens around. Now, as I'm getting to the end of this discussion of shrines and museums, I do want to also mention, of course, the food, and sort of use that to summarize and tie up Japan culture. As you can see, there is a lot of tradition and practices that are continue to be respected and practiced to this day. As a tourist, one of the things I enjoyed was the emphasis on a balanced diet and eating healthy. A lot of these breakfasts I was able to eat, you would get a protein like fish in this case, you would get vegetables, you would get rice, and you would get miso soup, and usually it would come to around $5 to $7 Canadian. Some other foods I ate a lot. I ate a lot of Japanese curries, one of my favorite types of ways to have curry. You have here too a more Western style meal, a egg McMuffin combo with hash brown and a coffee. You have another example of ramen with gyoza for $7. You have a dipping soba that underneath your vegetables, your wasabi, your daikon radish. You have a sauce, a thin soy sauce base that you would dip your noodles into rather than it coming in a bowl like a ramen would. You have different kinds of sushi. This is some of the conveyor belt style sushi, but you could also order a la carte to get in this case, a lunch special with a miso soup. And then to the left is the type of plates you would have circling around. More breakfast meals here. And then this is another example of conveyor belt sushi, which you could get a good 20 pieces of sushi for $16. So you could get your value for your money even there. And then another type of restaurant I ate at, I had this huge bowl of ramen. I had fried rice, 5 more gyoza, usually with pork, and a beer for $22 Canadian. So you got a lot of value. Not to mention you didn't have to worry about tipping culture like you do here. So to conclude, actually, again, more food. Ichiran ramen. You have a taiyaki, okonomiyaki on the left, and then you have a Whopper style hamburger from Burger King. Desserts, you have green tea ice cream and more like not a vanilla ice cream, but like a milk ice cream. And another thing that was really popular is melon soda as opposed to root beer or orange soda. And often you could get it mixed with ice cream as a float. So those were the types of ways I was able to enjoy dessert there. But to summarize, the main thing I wanted to bring is that at the end of the day, there are a lot of cultural differences. There's a lot of language differences. But at the end of the day, people are people. People are not governments. People are not religions. People are just trying to go about their day-to-day lives in the same way that you would back home in Canada. And so as long as you're being respectful, you try to speak as much Japanese as you can and try to be nice to people, and it really does go a long way. I really enjoyed the people I talked to. There were sometimes language barriers, but you learn to embrace it, and at the end of the day, it's really easy if you connect to things that people share in common, especially food and especially interests, whether it be games or anime. It really helped to just show appreciation. And when you do the little things, you bow, you thank the security guards and the members that work at the shrines, and you try not to make any big scenes and just appreciate being there. It really does go a long way, and it's certainly made me look forward to the next time I go to Japan, which will be fairly soon, sooner rather than later, I think. And yeah, that basically concludes what I wanted to talk about today for this episode. It was a lot more focused on just appreciating what I was fortunate enough to be able to go and see, and that I was able to accomplish it in a 3-week period was fantastic and a lot of fun. If anybody has any questions about the trip, about things that recommendations on sites to see, food, any basic travel tips. I didn't talk about my hotel stays or anything like that, but if you want any advice on that, I'm more than happy to ask. As you saw in the photos, they're all photos that I took, so they're all my own copyright and my own property. So if you would like a copy of any of the photos for any reasons, I'm more than happy to share them if you reach out. But in the next episode, I think I would like to talk to next about one aspect of Japan history and culture that I didn't bring up. As you can see, my little friends in the photo on the right allude to that. On the next episode, I would like to talk about the JRA and horse racing culture within Japan. So thank you for everyone for tuning in. If you are interested in any more reading material, some books that I referenced that you can look at are Lesley Downer's The Shortest History of Japan, Brett Walker's A Concise History of Japan, Marius Jansen's The Making of Modern Japan, and Saburo Ienaga's History of Japan, Volume 14 of the Travel Japan series. So thank you everybody for listening, and I hope to see you on the next episode. Take care and have a great week.